Welcome to this episode of Eureka. Let's look at leprosy. It's an infectious disease, and if in our environment there is this germ, not all of us get affected by it. Why someone is susceptible but not others? Most of us would pass away by saying it's our fate, but a scientist would not. The guest of our this show, Dr. Bomzai, a former professor of genetics from Jawaharlal Nehru University, has worked on this issue. We are going to have a conversation about this and many of us research work and also his reflection on higher education. Keep watching Eureka, but before that we will take a look at his brief profile and this conversation will continue. Keep watching Eureka.
Genetics and genomics both play roles in human health and disease. It is where Dr. Rameshwar Nath Kaul Bomzai has extensively worked. Dr. Bomzai is a renowned Indian scientist in the field of human genetics and cancer biology. He pursued his PhD at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, AIIMS, New Delhi, and got his degree in February 1979, working in the area of human genetics. Dr. Bomzai's PhD work related to before birth diagnosis of genetic disorders and the management of risk pregnancies. The professional career of Professor Bomzai began at IMS BHU between 1980 to 89 and then at JNU. Dr. Bomzai is a former professor in genetics from JNU and has also served as a Vice Chancellor of Sri Mata Vaishno Devi University, Katra, J&K between January 2010 to 2013. His scientific contribution is in the area of genetics susceptibility in the case of leprosy. Dr. Bomzai's work continues to understand the metabolomic implications due to perturbation of this glycolytic pathway enzyme, especially in cancer conditions, and the possible therapeutic target identification to contain tumor growth. His recent most contribution on microRNA and its role in breast cancer for therapeutic purposes to act very effectively in combination with minimal doses of cancer drugs. Dr. Bomzai received many national and international recognitions, noted among them is Padma Shri Award in the year 2012.
Thank you for being with us. It's a very interesting, very wonderful opportunity. You have a very illustrative career. From academics to being a vice chancellor of a university, there is a lot of experience, lot of background to your career spanning perhaps 40 to 50 years. Let me start with some of the very simple questions like, if I have to ask you, three major areas that you have worked on in this whole period, research work, what would you classify as three or four your important work?
Well, one of the areas was genetic susceptibility to leprosy, and why we chose leprosy as a model of disease was with a reason, because M. leprae does not change or mutate so rapidly as Mycobacterium tuberculosis does.
Okay.
So obviously, if we want to understand why host, which is human, provides a different response to the same bug, so better the bug may not change.
Suppose if the bug changes and human changes, you don't know whether it is
complex. It's too complex. So in order to delineate the susceptibility reasons within humans as a host, so we chose leprosy as a model of disease and tried to understand what genetic background in our blueprint, which all of us have, which is DNA, and what differences are there which provide the susceptibility, and try to understand if those variations in the genomic pattern, they lead to some functional variations, and these functional variations ultimately influence the immune response, and this immune response then becomes the responsible reason for providing a different phenotype.
See, one thing many public health officials would talk about is that people living in poor conditions or perhaps having less access to nutritious food are more susceptible, to many of the infectious diseases. But now you are talking about genetics. How these things are also related?
Telling you frankly, in evolution, Mycobacterium existed before human evolution.
Yeah.
And imagine after millions of years, then when humans come into picture, maybe 100,000 years back, the mycobacterium lodges there itself in the macrophages and sits there quietly and survives. So it's a very beautiful evolutionary question. We also addressed it during our course of research as a basic question, that how is it that this bug has been able to survive for thousands and thousands of years in humans and yet has not been cleared. But at the same time, during this course of evolution, it's only 5 to 10% of the population which gets infected and not the 90 to 95%. So it means evolution equipped the genomic material in such a fashion and selected it in such a fashion that most of us humans became resistant to it, and it's only 5 to 10% who suffer from it.
Okay. So, what factors actually make somebody susceptible, let's say for example leprosy? What did your research finding actually tell us?
We worked on not only the whole genome profile lately, but before that we used to take candidate gene kind of an approach, try to understand how immune response related genes are there or other genes which are related to it, and then try to understand the whole background within humans if it is different. So that gave us a structural understanding of the genome, but it had to be then layered over with the functional aspects, and then we try to understand functional aspects of it, and then ultimately its presentation in terms of biology within the body, and that's the immune response.
Yeah. So when you talk about the susceptibility, it's not only leprosy that you worked on, but you also worked on other areas, right? So what are the other areas?
So the second area, which is cancer, we picked up again sporadic form of breast cancer.
Okay.
And the breast cancer, two genes which are implicated, these are called BRCA1, BRCA2, BRCA1, BRCA2. They are only affecting 10% of the women. And rest, although breast cancer is rarely present in men also, but I'll confine myself to women here. And this is the 90% of the patients are suffering from breast cancer, women are suffering from breast cancer. So the question is the spontaneous or sporadic form of breast cancer, how is it appearing on the scene for majority of the people? So genes have not been mapped for this. Even till date we do not understand, like BRCA1, BRCA2 genes in familial cancer, we do not know exact genes for this complex disease.
Okay, so that such was one of your.
That's right.
Then you also try to look at type 2 diabetes, right?
We looked into diabetes also simultaneously, and again, type 2 diabetes is something which has now initiated in very early years of life, and this is because of lifestyle habits. So mind you here that I would consider both cancer and diabetes, type 2 diabetes, as lifestyle diseases also.
Okay.
Because one has to see that how your glucose metabolism and homeostasis is affected with your lifestyle. And then in the evolutionary perspective, we have looked into a variety of genes which were selected in evolution with good reasons to sustain yourself. And we probably made bad use of it by our sedentary habits and lifestyles, which has now resulted into high diabetes incidence.
No, when you say lifestyle, most of us would ordinarily understand it as, you wearing a, let's say, shirt or maybe wearing a branded shoe. I don't think that you mean that, right?
No,
it's something very deeper, something very different.
Yeah. So today's young man remains hungry for whole day, then goes in the evenings or nights, eats till late, does not sleep properly, burns himself or herself. Now this lifestyle is a bad lifestyle. And obviously the mitochondria in our, which is given by mother to both daughters and sons equally, and we have in nucleus the genome which is from both the parents, and in males we have Y chromosome from father. And so this is how we are designed genetically. We have nuclear genome from mother and father and mitochondrial genome from our mother. It turns out that the mitochondrial genomic material influences the nuclear genetic material and crosstalks with it.
Okay.
And this material also gets influenced by our lifestyle, because it's a machine, which an organelle which produces energy, which produces ATP for us, and not only energy but also controls or regulates a lot of metabolism within our body. And now if I have a bad mitochondria and I replace it with good mitochondria, my cell starts behaving at least reasonably well.
Okay.
So if I maltreat myself, so there's going to be signal from the mitochondria to the nucleus, and we have seen it that how epigenetically it regulates the genetic material, and the expression of that genetic material is skewed towards the bad aspects of metabolism.
So if it is something like this, right? I mean, this Pavlovian dog, I mean, you ring a bell and give a food. After some time, whenever you ring a bell, the dog kind of salivates. So it's something like that. Our mitochondrial DNA, because of our lifestyle, gets trained or attuned or started functioning in one way. Is that
Today, the knowledge base which is emerging is showing that not only mitochondrial expression of the genes is affected by our lifestyle, but also nuclear genes.
Okay.
And this happens epigenetically. And since I said how mitochondria can control epigenetically our nuclear genome, so the whole signaling process, the whole expression of that signaling process in terms of metabolism is deviated and tuned. It tunes the cell in a manner that we become over a period of time diabetic. Suppose my pancreatic cells now start behaving differently, and I am initially producing to compensate because I'm eating huge amount of food later and it gets digested. I need insulin, high insulin for this, high sugar in my body, and then over a period of time it compensates for that and then stops functioning over a period of time, over decades. And then I become type 2 diabetes.
I think very interesting point. One very interesting study that you have done. Maybe we need to take a very short break. Keep watching Rekha. We'll take a very short break and come back and continue this conversation. We will look into some of his other areas of research. Keep watching Rekha. Welcome back to Rekha. We are having a very interesting, very engaging conversation with Dr. Bamzai. He was a former professor of genetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. I mean, we were talking about some of your areas of work, and one area, as a person who set up this center, applied human genetics, was to look at cancer, which is becoming a very major threat even in a country like India, with average age going up. I suppose it's going to only go up, right? So, and you wanted to look at how our knowledge of genetics can be applied, let's say, for example, curing cancer. So, what kind of insights you gained in
the National Center of Applied Human Genetics was sanctioned in the year 2002 by University Grants Commission. It sustained well till the time I retired, and I wish it had continued. There were different areas. We wanted to understand genetic susceptibility to complex diseases, and complex diseases are the ones where more than one gene is involved.
Okay.
And the environment also plays a role to modulate the expression of these genes. So it becomes further complex to understand. That's why people prefer to focus on single gene diseases, monogenic diseases, which is rather simpler, though there are complications there too, but not as complex diseases. So we had taken this role upon ourselves. We chose these three models, as I mentioned: infectious diseases, leprosy as a model, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, to understand because it's relevant to our country, and similarly the cancer. In cancer, I said the sporadic breast cancer was one of the models which we picked up, since 90% of the breast cancers are sporadic or spontaneous in character. At genomic level, literature says we have also contributed our bit, and we have understood that there are too many lesions in the whole genomic material, our blueprint, when we look at different cancers. So in sporadic breast cancer, it's so heterogeneous that you can't draw one-to-one relationship in order to bring any therapeutic intervention in this. Then if you look at other layers of cellular expression in terms of transcription, post-transcriptional status, translational, post-translational status, epigenetic control status, if you look at all of this together and comprehensively try to understand, it makes the issue of understanding cancer very difficult, because there are too many targets to define or to look at. People have come out with answers in certain specific areas of cancer, and there are efficient treatment mechanisms available today, but still cancer is the buzzword because we have not been able to find an answer. We looked through a different approach in 90s, which was not accepted at that time. We saw that all these lesions in the genome, epigenome, transcriptional, post-translational, translational mechanism, it converges on a particular metabolic tuner.
Okay.
And this is a metabolism which is called glycolytic pathway.
Uh-huh.
So when we eat food, the glucose is produced, it is metabolized, and this metabolism of glucose is glycolysis.
Yeah.
And in the last step of the glycolysis, there's a particular enzyme which is called pyruvate kinase. And this pyruvate kinase, we all humans have two genes of this. A chromosome number 1 has one gene, chromosome number 15 has another gene. What we found out, this chromosome 15 gene produces two forms. One is called PKM2, another is called PKM1. So we found this PKM2 unregulated, dysregulated in a given situation
Okay.
where that's called Bloom syndrome. And these syndrome people get their cancer. Incidentally, we saw first Bloom syndrome case in India, we identified it. And since they get cancer in young age, and we were trying to map its gene, so we found out that this gene is responsible probably for cancer in Bloom syndrome. And we
Okay.
took the story further. So it was a story from genomics to metabolism, and we found a relationship, a convergence at this particular metabolic step, and tried to take this story further to understand how it's affecting cancer metabolism.
Okay, that's a kind of a path-breaking way of looking at this
That's
issue.
right.
That's a kind of a new turn.
Now it's being talked about a lot. Now it's being talked about a lot.
Okay, that's interesting. Another area that you perhaps also started thinking in new way when you put your group together is quantitatively looking at some of the biological processes, because most of us in our school days, perhaps even in undergraduate days of biology, any part of biology would study it only in a qualitative way. We rather almost never think quantitative.
True.
In fact, most people think that if they are going to do life sciences, they don't need maths at all. That's a kind of a general perception. But you are looking at how to bring in quantitative aspects into biological studies, right? So can you explain about
Yeah, what happened during this path of 4 decades in JNU, I headed bioinformatics in mid-90s, and that gave me an exposure to bioinformatics.
Okay.
And obviously, the importance of mathematics was in my mind when we used to develop cell cycle models in
Okay.
Banaras Hindu University with a mathematics professor.
Uh-huh.
And so obviously, it was in my mind that although I'm scared of mathematics as a biologist, but mathematics and physics knowledge is of great importance to all biologists, and youngsters need to register this very clearly, that they should study mathematics along with biology in order to do well and to understand it. So what we have done, that there is a network theory in biology which is understood in qualitative terms, and in order to make it quantitative, we try to look into physics principles, like we applied Hamiltonian energy to understand this network biology.
Okay.
And it gave us a quantitative expression to it, that if we remove a particular hub, how the whole network which I have generated out of it, the whole understanding, and it gives me an idea whether this hub can deregulate this network, or an edge, which is an important one, or has become a hub, can deregulate the metabolism, the network,
Okay. Okay.
in quantitative terms.
That's also a kind of a new area, new direction in which your group was going, right? That's a very interesting aspect, and this is where we'll take another short break. Keep watching Eureka. After the break, we are going to discuss with him his experience as a vice chancellor of a state university. Keep watching Eureka. We'll continue this conversation after the short break. Welcome back to Eureka. We are having a very wonderful, very engaging, informative conversation with Dr. Bamzai. He is a former professor of genetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Before the break, we were talking about your research work in your career. Now let me shift to something different. Like how come you got interested in this whole area? I mean, how come you became, let's say, fascinated, passionate about this area?
Well, during my childhood, obviously, I wouldn't have been fascinated by genetics because I wouldn't know it. And coming from a small place in Jammu and Kashmir, it was a period of innocence and ignorance. But during my post-graduation in Kashmir University, in the subject of zoology, I had a wonderful two teacher.
Okay.
who mentored me. So 2 teachers were there. One was Professor P.L. Dudha, another was Professor M.K. Rana.
Okay.
So Professor Dudha introduced genetics to me during the course of masters, and he talked about prenatal diagnosis to me as one of the emerging technologies at that time.
Okay.
And it registered in my mind. So when I came to All India Institute of Medical Sciences to do my PhD, I worked on prenatal diagnosis.
Okay.
And I was one of those first ones in the country who initiated that discipline of diagnosing birth disorders before the birth.
That is by taking amniotic fluid.
Those days, amniotic fluid. It was a struggling period, but because all over the world people were struggling at that time how to diagnose. So one had to establish normal values and other things, see how to culture these cells in vitro, all that stuff. And it was that was one of the initial motivations that these 2 teachers had inspired me.
And then brought you into this particular field. I mean, in a very different. That's very interesting. I mean, you went back to the same state as a vice chancellor of a university, right? It's a state university. And today, if you look at one of the common, let's say, grievance most people talk about is that the state universities are not actually functioning well as academic institution. They have become merely a degree granting institute. Research is not happening, the teaching is poor. There are lots of such opinions which are going around, and students complain that what they get is not making them employable. There are multiple grievances about state university. You headed a university. What do you think are the major issues in our higher education?
Well, this is not a very simple question to be answered in one go.
Yeah.
There are multiple layers to it. However, I'll try to tackle and answer all those layers which are there. As a vice chancellor, when you head an institution, obviously you look at institutional structure, and then you look at institutional sustenance, you look at institutional human resource, and obviously it's for the students, and the teachers have to mentor these students. So there has to be a good balance of the ecosystem in this, which has to be purely academic for excellence.
Okay.
So with this criteria, I set the tone and I made it more research oriented. I brought in teachers, even in engineering teachers. I prompted them that in what direction they could go and leave them open to initiate, ask for project proposals, bring in whatever money is possible, optimize expenditures, act as a role model that I don't fritter away things. So once you as a head of the institution show your academic strength and you show your moral uprightness, I suppose that becomes initial feature to set the tone in an institution, and then interact with students on a regular basis, understand their difficulties, solve them, create mechanisms within the institution to sort them out. There would be grievance. So I had academic grievance mechanisms separately from the social grievance mechanisms, because there were students from all over country and they had a lot of issues there and they needed to be resolved.
See, this is head of that institution, some of the challenges that you face. But let me ask you, I mean, you are a zoology student. But if you look at in most places, the curriculum of zoology even today is perhaps what we can call as archaic. I mean, like it's historical, just legacy. That this is what I studied, so most likely that's what the next generation. But I don't know whether that's a right way of looking at even undergraduate education. What's your reflection on that?
Yeah, I think you picked up on very important subject which I probably would like to communicate through this medium, that if you are a zoology student, you feel as if you're sort of, there is some kind of heen bhavana of that being in zoology, and you're not a biotechnology student.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, biotechnology has been brought in very early in 10+2 system. It's a specialized area which probably should be later, but that's another part of discussion. As a zoologist, I feel it gives you a perspective which is of system biology, because you understand the whole system together. It gave me a lot of advantage. In fact, I combined my reductionist approach of molecular biology with system biology, and I could bridge the two and understand the zoological aspect of human being in a greater sense, much before others could initiate in that area. So it had perspective. I wish I had a good support system at that point and appreciation at that point of time. Maybe we could have done better. But having said so, I suppose today's student of zoology, there has to be learning outcomes of each subject within the country, which has been initiated by University Grants Commission now lately. And I suppose these learning outcomes and hands-on exposures for different students have to give them confidence in what to do, make them skill oriented, so that what you mentioned, how they can become job oriented. The syllabus can be tweaked in the context of present biology, the modern biology, not losing the sights of evolution as a part of zoology, not losing the sight of the classification of animals, because people can't even identify them. So that's a pity, that you're a zoologist but you can't identify which animal is there. So taking from that level to a molecular understanding of it and understanding systems and comparing systems from a single cell organism, protozoan, to a multiple human, multicellular organism, and you have a perspective of a whole system in one go, rather than reading them one by one over years together, making it boring. So there have to be some basic changes which have to be brought in, and the learning outcome concept along with the modern biology has to be there to make it a better attractive subject and make them skillful to be absorbed in different jobs which are available.
Okay. One of the major challenge today India is facing is how do we restructure higher education? Right? I mean, it's one thing, one area that there is a huge discussion and debate. We all know that, for example, the way we are doing it is not perhaps fitting for emerging conditions. Maybe it was fine for earlier time, but not for emerging condition. Number of people in higher education, the kind of courses that we offer in higher education, the system that we have in higher education. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think times are appropriate today because there's a lot of churning going on. As I mentioned, that people are conscious of learning outcomes, people are conscious of skill-oriented, skill Vigyan programs associated in all different states. They being supported by different funding agencies like Department of Biotechnology has taken initiative. So human resources getting oriented in that way. Obviously, higher education does not mean only orienting, because people still are doing rote learning and they still score 99% marks to go in colleges and professional institutions. So this rote learning has to stop, and a conceptual development of a subject area has to emerge out of it. And then people have to be skillful in order to be useful for the society, for societal benefits. There is a lack in, there is a lot of information, but the lot of information is not compact and comprehensive.
Okay.
In terms of institutions, in terms of human resource, linking these institutional strengths and the human resource strengths together and creating these matrices to put on one another for a given goal. If suppose this happens in due course of time, then things will become better.
Thank you. Thank you. It has been a very wonderful conversation, from your research work to the higher education issues that we face today.
Thank you.
It's been a very wonderful conversation, very insightful. Keep watching Eureka. We will come back with another interesting conversation next week, same time.